On January 15, 1919, a wave 25 feet high tore through a Boston neighborhood at 35 miles an hour. It crushed buildings. It lifted a fire station clean off its foundation. It killed 21 people. The wave was made of molasses. Not a metaphor, not a translation error. 2.3 million gallons of raw industrial molasses, moving faster than most people could run, through one of the most densely packed immigrant neighborhoods in America. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood, the sweetest disaster in American history, and the reason your local engineer has to stamp their calculations before anyone builds anything ever again. But before we wade in, subscribe to Histoddities and tell us in the comments which other disasters history tried to make sound charming. Okay, grab your boots, this gets sticky. To understand why a tank of molasses turned into a weapon, you need to understand why anyone kept 50 feet of molasses in the middle of a city in the first place. Molasses wasn't just for baking. Distilled, it became industrial alcohol, and industrial alcohol made munitions. World War I had turned molasses into a strategic resource, and the United States Industrial Alcohol Company wanted a tank big enough to keep up with demand. So in 1915, they built one, 50 feet tall, 90 feet across, holding up to 2.3 million gallons. Wedged between a row of tenements and the harbor, right in the heart of the North End's Italian immigrant community. Here's the part that should concern you. The company's own treasurer signed off on the tank's design. Not an engineer. A man named Arthur Gell, whose main qualification was that he could read a spreadsheet. The plans were never reviewed by a chemist or engineer for structural stress. The tank was tested for leaks by filling it partway with water, once, and never with molasses at full capacity, under full pressure, in real weather. Tested with water. Filled with molasses. Nobody checked the difference. It leaked almost immediately. Neighborhood kids would come by with cups to scrape sweet syrup running down the outside. The company's solution wasn't to fix the tank. It was to paint it brown, so the leaks would be less visible. By January of 1919, the tank had a new deadline pressing on it. The 18th Amendment, Prohibition, had just been ratified. It would take effect within the year, and industrial alcohol production was about to get a lot more complicated to justify.
So the company was racing to process as much molasses into alcohol as possible before the rules changed.
The tank had just received a fresh shipment, warmed during transport, poured into a container that had spent the previous week in a hard freeze, cold steel, warm liquid. Fermentation already producing gas inside a tank that was already underbuilt for the pressure it was designed to hold. Let alone the pressure it was actually holding. January 15th was, unusually for a New England winter, almost balmy, close to 40 degrees Fahrenheit after a brutal cold snap. Temperature swings like that make steel expand. Expanding steel, on rivets already carrying more load than they were rated for, is not a combination anyone should want. At noon, workers and neighbors heard a sound like machine gun fire. It was the rivets. Thousands of them, popping in rapid succession down the side of the tank. Then the tank's side gave way entirely. 2.3 million gallons of molasses didn't spill. It detonated outward, in a wave initially 25 feet high, moving at an estimated 35 miles an hour, faster than a person can sprint. The wave lifted a firehouse off its foundation and threw it into Boston Harbor. It buckled the steel support beams of the elevated railway. It crushed homes, swept horses and wagons off their feet, and buried an entire city block in liquid that was, at that point, both scalding from the fermentation heat and thick enough that swimming was nearly impossible. 21 people died. Most of them drowned or suffocated in molasses that hardened around them before rescuers could dig them out. 150 more were injured. Seize, rescue, or 150 more were injured. Some rescuers reported the molasses was so viscous that pulling a single person free could take upward of an hour. The cleanup took weeks. Boston Harbor itself reportedly ran brown until summer. And this is the detail locals still repeat. For decades afterward, residents claimed that on a hot day, if the wind was right, you could still smell molasses in the north end. The wave moved faster than you can run. Historians still debate the exact wave height and speed. The numbers you just heard are the best estimates, not laboratory measurements. The company's first move was not an apology. It was a theory. United States Industrial Alcohol publicly blamed anarchists, claiming someone had bombed the tank. This was 1919, the height of America's first Red Scare, a year before the Wall Street bombing, a few years before Sacco and Vanzetti would become household names. Blaming an anarchist bomb wasn't just convenient. It was, for a nervous public, believable. Survivors and victims' families didn't buy it, and they sued. One of the largest class action cases in Massachusetts history at that point, consolidating over 100 individual claims. The case dragged on for 6 years. The court appointed an auditor, a retired Army colonel named Hugh Ogden, to sift the actual engineering evidence. And the evidence was damning. Undersized rivets, a safety factor far below industry standard even for 1915. No qualified engineer had ever reviewed the design. In 1925, Ogden ruled against the company. United States Industrial Alcohol paid out roughly $600,000 in settlements, several million in today's money, quietly, without ever fully admitting fault on paper. But the engineering findings were now part of the public record, and they were impossible to ignore. Here's where a disaster becomes infrastructure. In the wake of the case, Massachusetts and then other states began requiring that structural calculations for major construction be reviewed and stamped by a licensed, qualified engineer. Not a company treasurer with a clipboard. Professional engineering licensure, which had existed only unevenly before 1919, hardened into the standard we now take for granted. Every time a building, a bridge, or a tank gets built today with a stamped, certified structural review, there's a reasonable argument that the requirement traces back to 21 people who drowned in molasses in a Boston neighborhood because a company wanted to beat Prohibition to the punch. The Great Molasses Flood remains, by death toll, one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history, and one of the strangest. Historians still debate exactly how much the fermentation gas, the temperature swing, and the shoddy rivets each contributed, but nobody debates the outcome. Substance associated with pancakes and childhood, baking, killed 21 people in under a minute. Because a corporation cut corners on a deadline, nobody making the decision would ever personally answer for. So here's our question for the comments. If a flood of pancake syrup can rewrite America's engineering laws, what's the most ridiculous substance you'd actually be afraid of if enough of it hit you at once? If you enjoyed this, go watch our video on the Cadaver Synod next. A courtroom drama with a very different kind of victim. Subscribe so the algorithm doesn't leave us stuck in the mud. This has been Hist Oddities. Stay odd.